Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. This week we are picking up with the signs and wonders in Egypt in Exodus chapter 9, verses 8 through 12. This is the sign of the boils. So I'm going to begin by reading from my translation of the Hebrew, and then we'll dive into the process that I go through when I'm exploring something like this, a passage like this with all of its possibilities. This is a passage that I have a lot of questions about, and I'm not really sure of all of the answers, so I thought it might be fun to just walk through what are the kinds of questions that I ask when I come to the text. So beginning with chapter 9, verse 8. Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, "Take for yourselves handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses toss it skyward in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become grime upon the whole land of Egypt, and it shall become boils breaking out as blisters on human and on animal throughout the land of Egypt." So they took the soot of the kiln and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses tossed it skyward, and it was boils, blisters breaking out on human and animal. And the sorcerers were unable to stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils were on the sorcerers and on all the Egyptians. But Yahweh strengthened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen to them, just as Yahweh had spoken to Moses. All right, so what is going on in this passage? Well, the first thing to note is that the word kivshan could mean either furnace or kiln. It's not entirely clear. If it's a furnace, then probably it would have been used for the smelting of metal. If it's a kiln, then it would be used to bake bricks or other pottery. Now, given that the Israelites were employed in brick making in Egypt for Pharaoh's building projects, it's a very attractive idea to think that this sign begins with the product of the kiln where the bricks were fired. The problem is that most bricks were not fired in a kiln. They were sun-dried, but sometimes bricks were made in a kiln. So here's kind of the process that I go through as I think about, is this supposed to be a connection to the brick making of chapter 1? Well, we know from 19th and 20th dynasties of Egypt, which is around this time period, that the pyramids were built with regular sun-dried mud brick in the center, but an outer layer of kiln-fired bricks because they're more impervious to nature. So rain and sun and all of the weather will not break it down as quickly. So we know that the pyramids from a similar time period were made with kiln-fired bricks on the outer layer. So does that then suggest that perhaps the Israelites' building projects also incorporated kiln-fired bricks? And maybe so. We know that the Israelites were not the ones who built the pyramids. It's a different region of Egypt, and we don't have any evidence that they were involved there. But maybe a similar method was used since the time period is not too far off. So it's possible that the reason why God asks Moses to take some of the ash or soot from the kiln is because he's taking the product of the oppression of the Hebrews and using that to bring affliction on the Egyptians who have oppressed them. So that's a possibility. Another possibility that could be resonating here is that in later passages in the Old Testament, Egypt is often referred to as a furnace. The writer will say that God took the Israelites out of the furnace of affliction in Egypt. So one example of that you can check out is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 20, but there are others as well. The problem with this potential connection is that it's a different Hebrew word. Instead of kivshan, which is the word for furnace or kiln that we have in Exodus 9, the word in Deuteronomy 4 and other places that talk about Egypt as a furnace is kur. So kivshan and kur, they start with the same letter, but otherwise they're different words. So maybe, but it might be a stretch to see the connection there. Another possible connection is that after the Israelites get to Mount Sinai, when God appears to them in this very dramatic way, we're told that smoke was coming, billowing from the mountain like smoke from a kiln. That's Exodus 19:18. And it is indeed the same word kivshan that we get in this sign back in Egypt with the boils. So perhaps the narrator is trying to contrast Yahweh and Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the one whose oppressive labor results in this ash that then brings greater affliction, whereas Yahweh, when he appears and has the effect of like smoke from a kiln, is a better master. So that's a possibility. Now, one question that comes up with this sign is that we would expect Aaron to do the action because this is the third sign in the second cycle, and the third sign in the first cycle, Aaron does the acting. And so we would expect Aaron to do the action here too. And although we're told that he's present, Moses is the one who's told to throw the ash or soot in the air. It's possible that God is not wanting Aaron to be directly involved because he is set to be the high priest, and it would be unseemly for a high priest to be involved in creating a skin disease because priests are specifically the ones responsible for inspecting skin diseases later in Leviticus. So that's possible. You can check out Numbers chapter 12 to see what I mean about that. Some have suggested that this sign is a form of sympathetic magic, where the method matches to some degree the result of the magic. And so if this ash is kind of flaky and white, it results in this flaky white kind of skin disease or boils on the people. And it is true that we see the magicians or sorcerers show up in this sign again. They've been absent for a while, but now they're back. Only to be afflicted by this disease. So the very ones in Pharaoh's court who should be able to reverse the signs or should be able to counter sympathetic magic are instead affected by it. So if that's the case, if there's some kind of layer of sympathetic magic here, I would see it as God is using Egypt's own methods to best them. Now let's talk about the boils themselves. There's a lot of conversation in the commentaries about what in particular these afflictions are. Some have suggested they're festering boils or oozing with pus. Others have pointed to the possibility that they're hot or inflamed. So it's Moshe Greenberg talks about them being hot or inflamed. It's a little hard to be sure exactly what we're supposed to take away from this description because there's no other passages to compare it to. But Moshe Greenberg compares this phrase with Arabic and Aramaic cognates, and I've seen comparisons to Ugaritic as well. The word shechin, which is the word for boils, sounds like a word in these other languages that means hot or fevered or inflamed. So it's possible that this affliction, this skin affliction, is some kind of a burning rash, that there's a heat to it, and maybe that's the point. And it's also possible that it's oozing or pussy or something very unpleasant. This sort of affliction would have been considered ritually unclean by the priests in Leviticus, and so it's possible that the sense we're supposed to get from this sign is that the ritual uncleanness of Egypt is being made obvious. There's also a possible connection with the sign Moses gets at Mount Sinai. Remember back in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, before Moses goes to Egypt in the first place to confront Pharaoh, he's given two signs. The first is a staff turning into snake, which he performs in Pharaoh's court. But the other sign is when he puts his hand inside his cloak and then he takes it out again and it's afflicted with a skin disease. But then he never does it. So it's possible that what we're seeing here is the outworking of that initial sign that Moses had in his so-called bag of tricks. If so, actually either way, the point is that Yahweh has the power both to afflict and to heal. And so we see Pharaoh being defeated from another angle. As you can see, I don't have a settled opinion on what exactly the boils are, or why soot is being used, or why whether it's soot from a furnace or a kiln. What I'm doing is laying out all the possibilities of connections here. One last connection that I want to point out is from Deuteronomy 28:27 that warns the people if they're unfaithful to the covenant, then the boils of Egypt will come upon them. So that is a fascinating consequence. The Hebrews are getting a front row seat to the consequences of opposing Yahweh and his purposes. And then they're being warned in Deuteronomy that if they don't remain faithful subjects of Yahweh, the same thing could happen to them. God is not exalting the Israelites over and against every other nation. He's prioritizing the people who are going to live according to his rule, who are going to acknowledge his sovereignty and serve him willingly. And if they don't, there are disastrous consequences. This is the first time in the series of signs and wonders in Exodus that we are told that Yahweh does something to Pharaoh's heart. There have been mentions of it before in anticipation of what God would do, but this is the first time that Yahweh is said to have done it. And here he chazaks Pharaoh's heart, he strengthens it. But I just want to note, as I have in other previous videos, that when what Yahweh does to Pharaoh's heart does not circumvent Pharaoh's own free will, because Pharaoh, we're also told he did not listen to them. So Yahweh is doing strengthening, which is making Pharaoh more Pharaoh-like. Pharaoh's already chosen not to listen and not to respond. Yahweh's action in this case is simply to confirm what Pharaoh has freely chosen. So Yahweh anticipated that this is where this was going to go. He knew Pharaoh well enough to know how he would respond, and he announced that this was not a surprise to him and that he was not overwhelmed by it. But Pharaoh is still freely choosing not to listen and not to respond. So I hope this has been interesting. Next week, we will take a short break from our series of signs and wonders for a special announcement. Until then, have a great week.